The Gospel of Luke, the 19th chapter. And when he reached the descent from the Mount of Olives, the whole company of his disciples, in their joy, began to sing aloud the praises of God for all the great things they had seen. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven, glory in highest heaven. But some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, restrain your disciples. He answered, I tell you, if my disciples were silent, the stones would cry out. Then he went on to the Temple Mount and began driving out the traders with these words. Scripture says, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you've made it a cave for bandits. Day by day he taught in the temple. The chief priests and scribes, with the support of the leading citizens, wanted to bring about his death. But they found that they were helpless because the people all hung on his words. A spoof in the email this week that I can't resist passing on, Associated Press for immediate release, March 2002, French intellectuals to be deployed in Afghanistan to convince the Taliban of the non-existence of God. Kabul, the cleanup portion of the ground war in Afghanistan, heated up yesterday when the Allies revealed plans to airdrop a platoon of crack French existentialist philosophers into the country to destroy the morale of the remaining Taliban zealots by proving the non-existence of God. Elements from the feared Jean-Paul Sartre Brigade or Black Berets will be parachuted into the combat zones to spread doubt, despondency, and existential anomie among the enemy. Hardened by numerous intellectual battles fought during their long occupation of Paris' left bank, their first action will be to establish a number of sidewalk cafes at strategic points near the front lines. There they will drink coffee and talk animatedly about the absurd nature of life and man's lonely isolation in the universe. Their leader, Colonel Belmondo, spoke yesterday of his confidence in the success of their mission. Sorbonne graduate, a very intense, unshaven young man in a black pullover, he gesticulated wildly and said, the Taliban are caught in a logical fallacy of the most ridiculous proportions. I suppose the point is, you can't fight fanaticism with cynicism. In any case, the events of the past 6 months have certainly raised the question of the role of religion in our lives, public and personal, have they not? And there are those who would suggest that the arrogance and inhumanity of the terrorists is the product of their religious faith. And one does hear comments and read them to the effect that religion, especially the Western monotheistic kind, has been the source of most of the hatred and suffering over the centuries. We'd be better off with less religion, in other words. But in reality, our choice is not between the certainty of the fundamentalists of this world and the cynicism of the left bank in Paris. The choice is not between belief in God or skepticism about his existence. The choice we all face is a choice about what kind of God we believe in and try to live from. There is a generous sentiment abroad in our land that is inclined to grant all religious persuasions the benefit of the doubt, an insistence on tolerance of all points of view, acceptance of a religiously pluralist scene in which we refrain from passing judgment on our neighbors. But this often admirable attitude overlooks one thing. When it comes to our own self-understanding and the shaping of life together in community, it makes a great deal of difference what kind of God we have, how we vision God relating to us and to our world. Not whether he exists, but how he exists is the critical question when it comes to this business of living. The Christian story, the story of Jesus, the story whose culmination we remember this week, is the story of a conflict between two radically different ways of viewing God. Which vision shall we trust and live by is the issue that led to the events of this last week, 2,000 years ago. So perhaps a good place to begin with is to rehearse briefly the entire story. Bear with me. A 30-year-old Galilean young man emerges out of the obscurity of a traditional Jewish home centered around workshop, synagogue, extended family. We know him by his Greek name, Jesus, but he would have been Joshua to mother and brothers and neighbors. And then, by whatever impulse, he leaves all these familiar surroundings to journey down the Jordan Valley to near the Dead Sea, where his cousin, a self-styled prophet, is calling the Jewish people, including the religious elite, to a baptism of repentance for their failure to live by the will of their God. He identifies himself with John's baptism, and as he does, he experiences himself a deep sense of call to speak for God, to embody in his own life the will of God for his people. So he leaves John, and he spends long, lonely days in the desert struggling with this question: what kind of vision of God is he called to speak of and live out? He rejects there the reigning notions of that day, the picture of God as power and authority legitimating the religious leadership in Jerusalem, or God as an avenging power destined to destroy the enemies of Israel. Back in home country, he begins an itinerant ministry of teaching and healing, not unlike prophets before him, but it soon takes on a cast that disturbs as much as it distracts. He asserts an authority way beyond the tradition. He welcomes all comers without distinctions. He shares table with women and children and pagans. He comes in physical contact with the unclean. He assures even the outsiders of God's forgiveness. In a word, he seems indiscriminate in his lavish care for all human beings. And this, he seems to be saying, is the way the God of our forefathers really is. With his popularity waning then, he sets off to the center of religious power and authority, the center of another vision of the God of their fathers. And on a Palm Sunday morning, he rides down from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem after the pattern of Old Testament kings, asserting once more his authority to speak for God. In the precincts of the Temple Mount, he preaches day in and day out against the religious leadership and their use of the temple cult as a means of control of the populace. In a deliberate and very calculated act, he attacks the prerogatives of temple Judaism by throwing out those who extort funds from the people through the sale of temple coinage. In a word, he attacks the understanding of God that is present to his world through the authority and power of this priestly cult in place. Celebrating the Passover with his disciples on Mount Zion, this meal of remembrance of their liberation from Egypt, he uses bread and wine to interpret the meaning of the death he now anticipates, the gift of himself, his body and blood, to save his people, to save them by opening their eyes to the way God truly is present, and the way he calls them, therefore, to follow. And then on Mount Calvary, the next afternoon, before the eyes of the whole world, as it were, and with his own death, he lives out his conviction that God is present in sacrificial and self-giving love. A picture as old as Abraham and Isaac, yet as new wine, not condemning, not rejecting. The priests with their vested interests, Pilate with his political maneuvers, disciples fleeing and scared, mobs jeering and misunderstanding. I say it reverently, he hangs in there with them all, neither gives in to them nor gives up on them. He takes the pain a perverse world throws at him and in love prays astonishingly, Father, forgive them all because they don't know what they're doing. Now note, this dying really sums up his whole way of living, which is why it is so front and center in our scriptures, our worship, on our steeples, even hanging around our necks. The vision of a God who is present in the midst of suffering, not to deliver, but to grant strength. The vision of a God who comes not to be served as an oriental potentate, but to serve. The vision of a God who strides across the barriers between tribes and creeds that we erect to eat with Zacchaeus and praise Roman soldiers and touch the unclean and bless little children. In a word, a God who bears and believes and hopes and endures all of us. Note again, this is not the kind of God any of them were particularly comfortable with. If Jesus really embodies God, let him come down from that cross, they cry, and fix things, drive out the enemy, maybe drive up the stock prices, stamp his approval on our way of life, assure us we are special, sanction our use of power. That's what they really wanted of a God. And I'm not sure that we're all that comfortable with the picture either, even this day. We seem to want to get through Good Friday to Easter in a bit of a hurry. I'm not sure we're too comfortable given the way we have acted down the centuries and even now as church and individuals who bear his name. I'm not sure that we are comfortable with the cross, especially as it calls us to share the endurance, the bearing, the pain of God's kind of love among us. This God, the God of Jesus. For to love as God does means to be willing to endure, sacrifice, when the time comes, as it always does, when this is what love inevitably, sooner or later, will ask. Eugene Kennedy down at Loyola University puts it this way: enjoying spiritual feelings without spiritual ideas, of course, is what tacks the foam rubber on the cross. Spirituality under the modern template does not brace one for suffering leading to inner growth. Instead, it obliterates suffering by providing the musical equivalent of an injection from Dr. Feelgood. The New Age movement survives by ignoring or distracting us from the staples of any profound spirituality. Some sense of sin and acceptance of the tragic, and love conquering suffering and death to lead us to life. In her remarkable story called Angels Without Wings, Jane Yarmolinsky writes about the tragic death of her brother-in-law who perished in a freak accident. Then just 36 hours after his own death, his wife would die of cancer, leaving 3 small children without parents. Jane writes of her moments of reflection alone following this double tragedy. During the hour I sat by the pond, my thoughts slowly evolved, changing from a confrontation with death and anger at God to a confrontation with the lives ahead, young lives that had been broken, that needed mending. I didn't know whether I could handle the burden. I had no idea where the energy was going to come from to do all the things that needed to be done, to meet the gaping emotional needs created by such a double tragedy. But over time, I did find the energy. And some years went by before I could put a name to that energy. In those quiet moments alone, I had simply come face to face with God's ultimate, unconditional love for me in Jesus, right in the midst of it all. But I also discovered that you can't just live out that love in the abstract any more than you can paint a picture on the air. No, you need 5 boys and 2 girls and 1 husband and 3 dogs and 2 cats and 2 birds and lots of friends and much, much more. Because it's out of giving yourself to such mundane, nitty-gritty, often painful, never easy, real life that love is born. Perhaps we get a little bit of sense of what this dying was all about if we turn to the one scene of the week that I've not brought up yet, the hour he spent on his knees in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the prayer that he surely prayed over and over again. Father, if it's possible, let this pass. Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. It's a powerful picture of this one and all his humanity and need. I still remember it over the altar of Samuel Lutheran Church in Muskegon, Michigan, where Marlene and I were married. In a way, it's a way of kind of strange scene in which to stand there pledging yourself to another in love, but again, maybe not so strange. First of all, it reminds us that in this dying Jesus, we have no helpless victim. Some of us have been there in that garden, in the dark of that garden. It always occurs to me when I am there, he's no more than a couple hundred yards from the crown of Mount of Olives and the wilderness beyond, and escape back to the hills and sea he loved. He is no victim. But he does not seek death either. He does not want to die. Father, if it's possible. But he knows that in pressing his vision, in living out the love of God against the way of despotic rulers and disappointing crowds, death is probably inevitable. And any attempt to escape it or marshal his followers against it would mean to be untrue to his vision. His vision of a God who can be trusted whatever comes. So not my will, but yours. He's reached the point that we all reach sooner or later where life by the will of God means giving up control of our own destiny and trusting that everything is somehow in his hands. Even as he, we all want to live, don't we? Anything that threatens to rob us of life generates all kinds of fear and resistance, rejection. Without him, I'm dead, said the young woman about the husband who bailed out on her. Failure, if I don't make it. The grades, the executive suite, my life is over. Loneliness, it's a walking hell, that's what it is. You name it, whatever threatens your life, whatever scares you to death. But what about him? Why is he finally able to get up and go at it, through it? Because there in that garden he surrenders himself to a will and purpose beyond his own. Because he's willing to trust that the Father will be with him no matter what comes. Dante said, in his will is our peace. And that's the peace and strength that he's able to come to, which enables him to walk up that hill to another mount. Marvelous little plaque on the gate of the Garden of Gethsemane today, just a little thing. It has Jesus saying, Father, I do not understand you, but I trust you. Joe Sitzer, professor of history at Whitworth College, lost his wife, 4-year-old daughter, and mother in a car accident. He writes, I'm grateful that few people presumed to give me advice. Instead, they expressed shock, anger, and doubt. Why you, they would say. Why me? Most of us want to have control of our lives. And we succeed a great deal of the time, which is due in part to the enviable powers we have at our disposal in Western civilization. We do have access to good medical care, education, and entertainment. We have good jobs and comfortable homes. Consequently, we have the power to get much of what we want. But the possibility of so much control makes us vulnerable to disappointment when we lose it. Loss deprives us of control. Cancer ravages, violence erupts, divorce devastates, unemployment frustrates, death strikes, often with little warning. And suddenly we're forced to face our limitations squarely. Our expectations blow up in our face. We wonder what has gone wrong. We resent the intrusion, the inconvenience, the derailment. It is not something we were planning on. Why me, we ask. Well, despite the fact that I'd been a Christian for many years before the accident, since then God, as I meet him in Jesus and his cross, has become a living reality to me as never before. My confidence in God is somehow quieter but stronger. And I no longer feel pressure to impress or prove myself to anyone, yet I want to serve him with all my heart and strength. My life is still full of bounty, even as I continue to feel the pain. I've slowly learned where God belongs and have allowed him to assume that place at the center of life. Quietness, contentment, and simplicity have gradually found a place in me, though I've never been busier. I go to bed at night grateful for the events of the day, and I wake up in the morning eager to begin again. I think he found something of the faith of his Lord, enabling him to rest his life, whatever comes, in the hands of the one to whom it finally belongs. And it's a great place to be. The only place, I say, when the inevitable does come. In the pandemonium and pains of real life, a place of peace. Ride on in majesty, in lowly pomp, ride on to die. Bow thy meek head to mortal pain. Then take, O Christ, thy power and reign in you, in me. Amen.